Rock God is Stone Cold. The Hellraiser is back.
Here we go. Evolution of the Shield.
John Cena versus the Showstopper.
Hulk Hogan and The Rock in the same ring.
You will never take my place at the head of the table.
Undertaker with a Hell's Gate submission. Oh my God! What?
My God, Michaels just kicked Cena's head off.
The Monday Night Wars have come to WrestleMania.
It'll be The Rock. It'll be Austin one-on-one.
Third and five to the Undertaker.
Do you believe in miracles?
The streak is over.
Hey, what's going on, guys, and welcome back to Rivalries on the WWE podcast on this Friday, September 17th, as we are going to dive into a rivalry that took place in late 2002, early 2003, and that is Brock Lesnar versus The Big Show during the initial era of the brand extension in WWE, and a rivalry that first featured Brock Lesnar as a babyface in the company. And I feel like that's very relevant given the current run and return that we have seen of Brock Lesnar. But before we get into that, I just want to take a moment to give a shout out to all of you. Because unless my math is off, which is very, very possible, this is actually my 50th show with Rivalries, and it's I started thinking about it because it's been a little over a year since I started doing this with Matt. Obviously, I've been working on this podcast more as a guest host since May of 2019, but it's been a little over a year that I've been doing this weekly show, and there were a couple weeks where I had to take off because I was sick. I didn't do it over the holidays. So this is actually, and again, unless I'm messing it up here, my 50th show. And that's a pretty big milestone for me. But I couldn't have done it without you guys. And I just want to give you guys a big shout out and a thank you. Because this has always been a passion of mine. If you follow me at all on social media, on Twitter and whatnot, you also know that I'm a massive, massive hockey fan. Which kind of makes sense, seeing as how I come from Canada, Montreal more specifically. But wrestling has always been my first ever, I guess, love in a way. Don't tell my girlfriend that. But it was kind of like my first ever true love. And I've been watching it since I could remember. And I would also like to give Matt a big thank you for giving me the chance to do this show and record it for you guys. And I couldn't have done it without him, and he does a magnificent job as, really as the chairman of the board, for lack of better terms, of this entire podcast. And I can't thank him enough for having given me the opportunity to have entertained you guys with this podcast every week. And 50 down, hopefully 50 more to go. And, I was going over the list of rivalries that I've done to date, and there's still so many that I haven't even touched on, like Kane versus The Undertaker. Think about that. I've gone through 50 shows now, or this will be number 50, and I have not gone through Kane and The Undertaker. I haven't done Mick Foley versus Edge, Orton versus Taker. I haven't done Angle versus Brock, Taker versus McMahon. There are so many more options and roads to go down, but I just wanted to give you guys a shout out, and this is just the beginning. And I'm really looking forward to the next 50 and the 50 after that, and on and so forth. And one more thing I just wanted to get out there before we jump into Brock versus The Big Show is I know Matt got a mailbag question that was directed for me for a Roman Reigns rivalry. And for me to cover another Roman Reigns rivalry. And I will get there. I believe the next rivalry that I have planned for Roman Reigns is him versus Bray Wyatt in 2015. But for that listener, and I apologize, I don't remember your name, I've done several Roman Reigns rivalries since starting the show, and he's one of the most recurring names on this list, along with Triple H and Brock Lesnar. So I've done Roman Reigns versus Brock, as I just said. I've done Roman Reigns versus Triple H. I've done The Shield versus Evolution. And there will be some more Roman Reigns rivalries to come, but those are just a few in case you wanted something for the meantime. But enough about that. Let's jump into Brock versus The Big Show in 2002. So first of all, you got to get the lay of the land here of the WWE landscape at the time. They were just diving into the brand extension. And I know it had technically been in effect since March of 2002, but it only really felt real, truly, when Bischoff and Stephanie McMahon came into power of Raw and SmackDown, respectively. And really, when Brock and the WWE Championship became exclusive to SmackDown, and Bischoff brought back the WCW Championship and rechristened it as the World Heavyweight title. So, as we know, Brock goes to SmackDown, and his first ever rivalry is him going over The Rock at SummerSlam 2002. A mega victory for Brock Lesnar over one of the biggest stars in the company of all time, the biggest star at that moment, bar none, especially with Stone Cold Steve Austin in the midst of his walkout and on a hiatus. And you had Brock really get cemented at the top of the mountain. Then at No Mercy in 2002, he has a Hell in a Cell match against The Undertaker, the first of many collisions between the two over the course of their respective careers. And side note, another rivalry I will definitely be doing in the near future. And you have Brock almost by default turn babyface because he gets the respect of The Undertaker. And shortly thereafter, on SmackDown, we get an attack on The Undertaker that would soon have a direct impact on Brock Lesnar.
My body. Hold on a minute. Hold on a minute.
It's the Big Show.
I know I just didn't hear that. Brock Lesnar had your number? Brock Lesnar's the best? Why don't you give credit where credit's due? It's because of me Brock Lesnar was able to beat you at Hell in a Cell. What? That's right, because of me. You don't forget, for the past 2 years, it's been me all around this country that's been busting you up. It's been me that made you walk with a limp. Oh yeah, it's because of me that you are nothing but a broken down has-been.
So the Big Show comes out and starts telling The Undertaker that it's because of him that Brock Lesnar defeated him at Hell in a Cell. And it was really kind of laughable at this point because you have to take into consideration where the Big Show was in his career. And the Big Show for the better part of a year had really become irrelevant. Right after the Invasion angle closed at Survivor Series 2001 the year prior, a match that he was involved in, the 5-on-5 winner-take-all, and he was the first eliminated in, he really kind of slid into obscurity. You know, you look at what went on in early to mid 2002, and the Big Show just really became a non-factor in the WWE landscape. And you look at WrestleMania, he didn't even have a match on the card. You look at SummerSlam, he didn't even have a match on the card. You look at No Mercy, the pay-per-view that had just transpired, did not even have a match on the card. So the Big Show at this point in time was a very irrelevant figure in the WWE. And I think that's why when this happened and he came out and he starts chirping The Undertaker, a guy who had just returned babyface at this point, had just had a run with the Undisputed Championship, had just gone 10-0 at WrestleMania not 6 months prior, and one of the biggest stars in the company at this time, telling him that he's the reason that you're becoming a washed-up has-been. It really was just like, okay, what are you going for here? Big Show's one of the most irrelevant guys ever. And another thing Big Show had done is that he took part in that rejuvenated NWO in the summer of 2002 with the likes of HBK and not Testa, Booker T, X-Pac was involved. So they really had a big job to legitimize Big Show as a legitimate main event threat at this point in WWE. And he had just come over from Monday Night Raw onto SmackDown recently because he was originally drafted to Raw. He complained to Bischoff. He gets traded to SmackDown. So for him to go toe-to-toe with The Undertaker right off the bat really seemed like kind of out of left field. But Big Show wasn't done just talking to The Undertaker. He had some actions to show Taker, and by extension Brock Lesnar, that he meant business. So he chases The Undertaker up the ramp and tosses him off the stage through the table on the outside, because if you remember at this time you kind of had the stage that was way more elevated, and then on the outside of the ring you had tables and electrical gear and all that. So this really catapults Big Show up the top of the card and kind of puts him in the main event scene. And then thus starts building towards him versus Brock Lesnar at Survivor Series 2002. And the theme of this was that Paul Heyman was repeatedly telling Brock Lesnar that you can't pick a fight with this guy. This guy is too dangerous. You can't go up against the Big Show here. And again, it seemed a bit far-fetched given how the Big Show had been positioned over the prior 12 months or so, but him taking out The Undertaker really did a lot to help that and reestablish him as a true big monster. And when they really start going head to head, the Big Show was using that to his advantage, and he really started building momentum. I know it's a cliche, but in this instance it fits, towards Survivor Series. He takes out Brock Lesnar a few times, and then finally, Paul Heyman is telling Brock Lesnar, not to confront the Big Show, just let bygones be bygones. And then finally, Brock assaults the Big Show with a steel chair, heading into Survivor Series 2002. But Brock was still injured at this point because of the beating that Big Show had given him. And you have to understand is that even though Brock had beaten The Rock, even though he had defeated Undertaker in Hell in a Cell, it was still the first time that he was visibly outmatched. And that was rare, right? Even for Brock, who had only been around for 6 or 7 months by this point. But he was so much bigger than The Rock. He wasn't as tall as The Undertaker, but he was still a thicker, more muscular guy. And then you have the Big Show and this visual of, oh my God, how is Brock going to match up to the world's largest athlete? And not only that, but now you have them building a lot of steam behind the Big Show into Survivor Series and their match by taking out The Undertaker, assaulting Brock behind the scenes. But now you have Paul Heyman even scared for Brock's well-being going into Survivor Series 2002. And when the match finally did come, Paul Heyman had a big hand in the outcome, but not one you may have expected.
I've never seen him like that in my life. And Paul Heyman with a chair, tossing a steel chair to his client. Brock Lesnar's never been pinned. Brock Lesnar has never submitted. The referee's been knocked down and there's a steel chair in the ring. Big Show's never been suplexed like that. Forget about all those stuff. Oh, look out. Big Show. Brock Lesnar battling out. Steel chair in hand. And Big Show. Oh, a shot off the skull. Big Show trying to punch the chair. F5. Oh, my God. No way. No way. F5. Lesnar has F5. 500 pounds. And here comes the new referee in the ring. You retain. Wait a minute. What the hell is it? Heyman just... Lesnar had the show beaten and Heyman pulled his... What the hell's going on? Wait a minute, I can't believe what the hell was that? What? Lesnar and Heyman worked together and the Brock just had fun show. And Heyman... I think Brock Lesnar just realized that he's been had by Heyman. Yeah, Heyman, you better run these slimy. What a scumbag Heyman is. Lesnar in pursuit. Look at Show. He walked into a steel chair to the ribs. Oh, the back. Paul Heyman. Son of a... Oh, no. Big Show. Slam to the steel chair. And the evidence has been tossed out of the ring. As Heyman throws the referee like this. Not like this. Kick out Brock Heyman. Paul Heyman is son of a Brock Lesnar. Here's your winner and the new WWE champion, Big Show. And Paul Heyman, a slimy scumbag. He screwed Brock Lesnar. But why? Why did Paul Heyman screw Brock Lesnar?
So, just when you think that Paul Heyman was going to once again aid Brock Lesnar in retaining the championship, or at least just getting a win, he turns on Brock and helps the Big Show become the new WWE champion. And it made sense in a lot of ways, right? So, I think that at this point, it was clear that they were pushing Brock Lesnar as the main event level babyface, which made sense. And I think that with Steve Austin gone and out of the picture, with The Rock in Hollywood and the last time we had seen him being booed out of the building, the company desperately needed a top-level babyface. They had just lost the two biggest stars of the last generation, the two most over babyfaces they had seen probably since the early days of Bret Hart. And they needed someone desperately to fill those shoes. And that guy was Brock Lesnar, and I completely understand why they chose to turn him babyface so early in his career. But you can't really have a top-level main event babyface with Paul Heyman at his side, right? Paul Heyman, whoever he is with, unless he is the ECW version of himself, automatically makes who he's involved with, by extension, a heel. And we've seen that now. You know, they wanted to legitimize Roman Reigns as a main event level heel. Insert Paul Heyman. It's just a formula that always works. And at this point, you could probably make the case that he was more hated than he is now. Because now you've kind of grown to really love and appreciate the work that Paul Heyman does on the mic. And you've kind of heard of what he's done behind the scenes. We've had the ECW One Night Stand a few times, the rebirth of ECW, that really kind of got him over as a babyface. But at this time, you know, he was fresh off of the Invasion angle where he aligned with Stephanie and Shane. He had been on commentary with Jim Ross in the absence of Jerry Lawler, where he did play the overwhelming heel. So you really couldn't establish Brock as a babyface while simultaneously having him paired with Paul Heyman. Now, obviously, hindsight's 2020, and you look over the succeeding 20 years or so, and we know that Heyman and Lesnar have ultimately really become peanut butter and jelly. But at this time, when you put yourself in the moment, it made a lot of sense to move on from Heyman beside Brock Lesnar. Now you look at it from the point of the perspective of the Big Show. This was them, I think, trying to reinvent the Big Show and really put steam back behind him as a monster level heel and a legitimate main event guy. Because they didn't just need baby faces at this time. They needed main eventers. You know, you take out Rock and Austin, and that's a massive void at the top of the card. And if you're going to turn some heels, in this instance, Brock Lesnar or The Undertaker more recently, back to baby faces to compensate for that, you're going to need some guys to take those heels' places as well. And you insert the Big Show. And in a lot of ways, this was a very short-lived run for the Big Show, but I think in a lot of ways it was one of his better runs. For instance, this was the last time he would ever win the WWE Championship. That was the first thing, and it's pretty crazy to think about because he was a full-time competitor up until when? 2015 about? And wrestled part-time all the way until 2017, give or take. And I know he had a very good run with the World Heavyweight Championship in 2012, I believe, a very underrated program with Sheamus. He had a very solid run with the ECW World title in 2006. But to think back that this was his last ever WWE Championship victory, that's a long time. That's a really long time that the Big Show went in between his last title and his eventual retirement without having won the biggest championship on in the company. And I think that you look at Big Show and they were trying to reinvent him. Like, this was when he was wearing jeans while wrestling, like over his attire. I don't really know what you call that. He always wore that like swimsuit type looking thing, but he was wearing jeans over it. I remember, let's say, like on SmackDown, he would wear suits or like a nice sweater, and I appreciated it because they were trying to switch up his look. They were trying to switch up his character, one that had really become stale over the latter part of 2001 and almost for the entirety of 2002. So they were really trying to do a big job here to cement the Big Show as a main event level guy on equal footing to Brock Lesnar. And then you get to what happens between Survivor Series and Armageddon 2002. Brock, obviously livid, starts attacking people on SmackDown and eventually gets suspended by then GM Stephanie McMahon. And then you get a number one contenders match between Kurt Angle, Edge, Chris Benoit, and I believe Eddie Guerrero to find out who would become the number one contender for the WWE Championship, ultimately becoming Kurt Angle. They go on to Armageddon, and the build to this is that Kurt Angle was telling Brock, I'll try and get your suspension lifted if you're in my corner for the pay-per-view at Armageddon to help me out, because I know that I won't be able to defeat the Big Show on my own. With Paul Heyman in his corner, at that point, the A-Train had kind of become a lackey for Kurt Angle at this point, or for the Big Show rather. And lo and behold, Stephanie McMahon gets the suspension lifted. In the middle of the match, the referee gets knocked out. The A-Train gets involved, but Brock runs to the ring, F5s the Big Show, and helps Kurt Angle win the WWE Championship away from the Big Show. So the Big Show's only run, or his last run rather, with the championship lasts the length of one small stretch in between pay-per-views. The next night the following SmackDown, it's revealed that Paul Heyman is actually in cahoots with Kurt Angle and comes out to the ring. The Big Show's furious, but then he somehow convinces the Big Show that it's in their best interest. that as long as one of Kurt Angle or the Big Show has the WWE Championship and Brock doesn't, that's the most important thing. So this eventually was really a stepping stone for Brock to get to Kurt Angle. That's essentially what the Big Show was used here for in 2002 and early 2003. Because Kurt Angle would go on to hold this championship all the way to WrestleMania 19. But the Big Show and Brock's rivalry did not end there, as they collided at the Royal Rumble 2003. And on the first match on the card, the stipulation was whoever wins that match will enter the Royal Rumble. Lo and behold, Brock Lesnar defeats the Big Show, enters the Royal Rumble, goes on to WrestleMania 19 to main event the show with Kurt Angle, eventually winning the WWE Championship away from Kurt Angle in what was one of the more underrated WrestleMania main events of all time. But him and the Big Show were not done there, as they collided a few months later down the line on an episode of SmackDown in a moment that would ultimately become one of the most memorable and historic moments in the history of the company.
The champion. Whoa. Wait a minute. No. Oh, my God. No. Lesnar with a coming close to the back. No freaking way. Is he setting Big Show up? Superplex. No, he can't do it. A 500-pound superplex. Brock Lesnar to the top rope. Top rope. A 500-pound superplex. Oh, my God. What the hell? The ring just imploded. The ring blew up. Both Lesnar and Big Show are down and out. A superplex imploded the ring.
So I'm sure you guys all remember that moment. The superplex heard around the world on June 12th, I believe, in 2003 on an episode of SmackDown, when Brock suplexes the Big Show and the ring absolutely implodes. And something I still don't know if it was a work or it was real. I mean, both are equally as possible if you ask me. But I mean, when you think of Brock versus the Big Show, that's kind of like the lasting memory, right? Even though they had several WWE Championship matches, you know, they had another championship match on another episode of SmackDown in 2003, aside from this one where like Mr. America got involved and Kurt Angle got involved and all them. But this is kind of like the moment, even including their match at Survivor Series, that really stands out as, you know, the Big Show versus Brock moment. And I mean, it was just such a crazy visual, right? And to be honest, I think the biggest part about this rivalry was the visual aspect of seeing Brock just so overwhelmingly physically outmatched by a guy like the Big Show. And to this day, has there ever been someone to match up to Brock like that? Like, I guess maybe Braun Strowman. He's someone that, from a visual standpoint, outmatched Brock Lesnar. But there was something to be said about Big Show going up against Brock and making Brock look extremely, extremely more human, I would say. And, you know, this rivalry would lie dormant for just about 11 years or so. And actually, in late 2004, they would actually align. They would become partners, as we actually had Team Lesnar go up against Team Angle at Survivor Series in 2004. And Team Lesnar featured the Big Show. You had Lesnar as WWE champion and Big Show as US champion, as kind of the top two heels on Raw running roughshod on everything, with then SmackDown GM Paul Heyman at the helm. And with both of them as heels up against a babyface Kurt Angle, it really, really worked well. And if you look back at this time, they were really trying to figure out what to do on SmackDown. Like, they weren't sure who to use as the main heel, the main bad guy, who should be the champion. You know, Kurt Angle and Brock kind of double turned in the middle of 2003. And then eventually you move on to Guerrero in 2004. But Big Show and Lesnar aligned eventually in the latter half of that year and went into Survivor Series as teammates. As we all know, early 2004, Brock walks away from the company and doesn't show up again until 2012. And in 2012 and 2013, you really have Brock trying to be re-established as one of the main attractions and legitimate forces in WWE. And, he had defeated Triple H at WrestleMania, or not at WrestleMania, at SummerSlam, and I believe it was Extreme Rules in the Steel Cage match. He had just come off of a rivalry with CM Punk, and then had gone up against Mark Henry. But he had still yet to win a championship upon his return, and we weren't really sure how to feel about Brock just about 2 years into his return to WWE by the time early 2014 came around. But lo and behold, WWE went back to the well in trying to re-establish Brock Lesnar as a top-level wrestler.
If Brock Lesnar breaks the arm, we would have to assume, of Mark Henry. Brock Lesnar has been unstoppable. Here's Paul Heyman just screaming at Mark Henry, asking the question, why would you do this? I admire Mark's bravery. That was not smart. Brock Lesnar just took down a 400-plus pound man who may have broken his arm, who had no business coming to the ring in the condition of Mark Henry was in. Brock Lesnar just broke the world's largest man's arm. This is going to be a fight. The world's largest athlete. Oh, my God. The Big Show. We are about to see a collision.
So it was the first time that you ever saw Brock really manhandled upon his return. And, he had just beat Mark Henry a few weeks prior. Mark Henry comes back to the ring. Brock breaks his arm with the Kimura. And just as he's leaving, he's confronted by the Big Show and is really intimidated and then literally tossed out of the ring. So once again, you have Brock on kind of a meteoric rise, but this time as a heel. And WWE goes back to the well to use the Big Show to kind of be that final stepping stone. Like, okay, you really want to be the top dog here? Now you got to go through me. And then you get the following week on Monday Night Raw where they go face to face again. And one more time, the Big Show quite literally tosses Brock out of the ring. And Brock gets visibly mad and he's smashing the chair because he's able to outpower everyone. He's able to destroy and conquer every single competitor that comes through his way. And once again, as we saw 10 years earlier in 2002 and 2003, the Big Show is finally that guy to match up against Brock Lesnar and finally be the neutralizer in a lot of ways to Brock's strength. And this ultimately leads to a match at the Royal Rumble in 2014 between Brock Lesnar and The Big Show. And before the match could even get underway officially, Brock Lesnar made his presence felt in a massive way and just completely assaulted The Big Show.
And this is smart move.
Match hasn't begun. Brock just took him down.
Yeah, but smart move by Lesnar.
Full mount.
Smart move by Brock Lesnar. Now Heyman tossing a steel chair in. Again, the match has not started. The bell has not rung.
Watch out!
Brock Lesnar unloading on the Big Show.
The referee's going to have to try to get some kind of control here.
The official has never called for the bell to start this match.
I don't think Brock cares.
Whether you agree or not, this was great strategy by Lesnar. He'd been manhandled by Big Show for weeks and weeks, and tonight gets the upper hand right from the beginning.
You know what this tells me? Obviously, Brock Lesnar does not want to fight this man. No, I tell you what it tells me is exactly what Paul Heyman said earlier. Brock Lesnar wants a title match. He declared himself the #1 contender. He has no desire to be in a singles match here. He has no desire to be in a Royal Rumble. He wants the WWE World Heavyweight Championship. He does not want to fight the Big Show. He's fighting the Big Show right now.
And his advocate, Paul Heyman, loves what he sees.
The match has not even started.
Oh, Big Show can do whatever he wants. Get up and do it.
I think Brock Lesnar knew from the get-go he was going to...
So before the match even starts, Brock absolutely destroys the Big Show with a chair. And as the match progresses and never even really gets off the ground, Brock Lesnar just continues the onslaught on the Big Show.
Tell you what it is, it's a shameful display. Brock Lesnar has never been manhandled like that in his life. I think it infuriated him. Also the fact that Brock says he's the #1 contender. How many times has Lesnar hit Big Show in a chair? He's not done.
Heyman vowed that Lesnar would annihilate the Big Show tonight.
Annihilated that chair.
That is the second chair.
Not another one. Come on.
The second chair, steel chair that Brock has broke.
I think that's
over
the
the
third
Big Show.
chair. You're right.
I mean, this is ridiculous. This is called angering Brock Lesnar.
I mean, this has got to be stopped. That's enough.
Who's going to stop it? Who's going to stop Brock? He comes out here and declares himself the #1 contender. Nobody says it.
Oh, my God.
Whoa.
That was a big mistake right there.
Yeah, Brock's over.
So you get the picture. This goes on for about another minute or so. And this happened before the match started. The clip I played before. Brock actually gets the victory over the Big Show. And this happens following the match. In a display of probably 6 minutes of just beating the Big Show relentlessly with the steel chair. And I think this was a way, yet again, of legitimizing Brock Lesnar as a force to be reckoned with in the WWE upon his return to the company. And we all know that following this program, he goes on to WrestleMania 30, ends the streak against The Undertaker, and then at SummerSlam of that year, absolutely squashes John Cena to become the WWE World Heavyweight Champion, and really kind of runs roughshod over WWE on and off from, I would say, right around this time in early 2014, right up until 2019 or 2020 actually, until Drew McIntyre dethroned him. And that was like a 6-year run of Brock Lesnar where his losses were few and far between. And in a lot of ways, it was kickstarted by the Big Show yet again. And in 2002, we saw them, or early 2003, we saw them kick off Brock's rise to stardom with that win over the Big Show at the Royal Rumble in 2003 and catapult him into the main event of WrestleMania 19. And 11 years later, we see him do it, but this time as a heel, and kind of catapult him on a meteoric rise that really culminates with him ending this Taker streak, crushing John Cena, winning the World Championship for the first time since returning to the company. And I think that Big Show played a massive part in Brock Lesnar's success in WWE, just because in a lot of ways, there was no guy who could visually match up and kind of overtake the dominance of Brock Lesnar. And just the absolute vibe these two had in the ring was almost unmatched. You can make the case that it was Brock's best rivalry, although Kurt Angle may have something to say about that. Taker may have something to say about that. Now you could say that Roman Reigns could have something to say about that. But maybe from the Big Show standpoint, this was his best rivalry. I think it's the time that Big Show felt the most legitimate is when he was feuding with Brock in late 2002, early 2003. This was probably the most notable program he had in the latter part of his career. So, I mean, it was a very memorable rivalry for both guys. Probably helped the Big Show a little bit more just because of how much of a dominant and incredible superstar Brock ultimately became. But either way you shake it, this was a very memorable rivalry, and one that will ever be looked back on as one of the more visually imposing matchups that we'll ever see in the history of the company. Well, anyway, guys, that's all I got for you today. I hope you enjoyed Brock versus the Big Show. And thank you again for making this show possible here on the WWE podcast. And, 50 down, 50 plus more to go. And I really can't wait for what's still left in store for us here on this great journey we're on. But as always, you can get me on Twitter at ADeMarco25. You can get Matt on Twitter at wrestling_audio. Or you can email him at realwwepodcast@gmail.com. So as always, guys, stay safe out there, and I'll talk to you next week.